Did you know that BDSM and Kink are healthy outlets for aggression, imagination, and attention? Hi, and welcome to the Partition, home of Kinky Wellness. My name is Dana Slosser, and I'm a sexual wellness coach that dives deep into all things kinky. I'm here to show how BDSM and Kink deserves a rightful spot within the sexual wellness conversation. So, let's talk about it. Welcome to the Partition's first podcast. My name is Dana Slosser, and I'm a sexual wellness coach, but I like to consider myself more of a kinky wellness coach. On today's episode, I want to talk a little bit more about the Partition, myself, and how I came to be here. So a little bit about me is I grew up in two households. My parents were divorced before I was 2. So my primary caregiver was my mom, but on every other weekend, I would be at my dad's house, and that's where I really learned to play. There we were allowed to play rough, creatively. There kind of was no rules at my dad's house in the same way that on my mom's side of the family, there were a lot of rules. So at my dad's house, we were encouraged to play outside, encouraged to get dirty, encouraged to play around on the floor. My dad was pretty athletic, and he seemed to do a lot of sports. So my childhood on my dad's side was surrounded by a lot of playing with other kids outside. I think because he was so into sports, that's why I was also into roughhousing. But as much as I loved playing rough or being athletic, I was a pretty angry kid. Life with divorced parents who absolutely hated each other was not easy. And by the time I was 13, I had 2 more stepdads come and go, and I transferred elementary schools 6 times. So yeah, I was a pretty angry kid. But at least as a little kid, I was able to get my anger out by at least playing rough. But the older I got, the less chances I actually had to play rough. But that still didn't change the fact that I had some serious pent-up energy and anger issues. And because that pissed-off little kid didn't really have any outlet to fix that, I grew up into a really pissed-off teenager who was 100 times worse. Then around the time I was 14, my dad lost his job as a truck driver because he was responsible for a drinking and driving accident. And because he didn't have any money, the bank ended up repossessing the only stable home I ever knew. At this point, I was extremely angry, and I really was trying to keep it together. And then a few months later, he disappeared out of my life. He stopped coming to the house. He stopped answering calls. He just sneaked away, I guess. He just faded into the background. And then about a year later after that, my mom met another person online, and a few months later, she too disappeared to Europe with her newest husband. So when she told us that she was leaving, at this point, my dad was not around. And then she told my brother and I about a day or 2 before she was going, I think it was Dominican Republic or something like that, to meet this guy. And then when she came back, she basically declared she was getting married again and moved. So yeah, very early, I was still in high school and both my parents were gone. And I didn't really remember a time when I wasn't angry. So when I saw BDSM for the first time in high school, I was actually naturally drawn to it. And I wanted to see more of it. But whenever I tried to show my friends, they would question me by asking if I was seriously into this, and they were concerned. And because I didn't have anyone at home to talk to, I took whatever I watched about sex at face value. And after watching a few videos online, I had convinced myself I knew what I was doing. And it wouldn't take until my early 20s where I realized that a lot of the foundations that I did know off BDSM were completely false and could actually seriously hurt somebody. So actually, it's kind of a funny story, but one random night in my early 20s, a guy on the street and I saw someone try to push a woman through a window. And long story short, we ended up calling the cops, and after we exchanged our statements to the police officers, we exchanged phone numbers. And which was kind of cute because we definitely had some serious sexual energy going on, so it didn't take long for us to start making plans to hook up and get together to, basically have sex. Except this time it was much, much different. This gentleman really did surprise me to questions that had never been asked before. He asked me how I'd like to be held after sex and what names he could call me and what my pain tolerance was. Like some of these questions, like what were my boundaries, like I had heard those before, but to ask how I wanted to be held after sex was completely new for me. So up until this point, I thought I had a pretty decent idea about sex because I wasn't shy about the topic, and growing up, I was really part of a really open and sex-positive friend group. So talking about sex wasn't something new. But now having him ask me these type of questions and ask me if I could hit them and if he could hit me, I realized very quickly that I actually knew nothing about BDSM at all. And basically, I questioned if I knew anything about sex at all, other than knowing some mechanical techniques that you hope produce a positive outcome for both parties. It wasn't too emotional or mental. So having him there, I was like flooded with a wave of excitement, and all the years of wanting to try BDSM and thinking I was doing BDSM and never really getting a chance was finally in front of me. So of course I said yes, and I was very excited and very eager to have him over. But the first time he came over wasn't that exciting. It was more of a demonstration day. At first, I was nervous about hurting him properly. I think I was nervous that I would miss and punch him in the face by accident. I was kind of scared, actually, but after some reassurance and confidence, and I knew that I had some sort of accuracy because I had still played baseball all these number of years, and like at least that's what I was telling myself anyways. I began hurting him the way that he wanted to when I was ready and when he was ready and when he believed in me. And I actually couldn't believe what I was feeling. After hitting him, it was like decades of anger were melting out of my nerves, through my skin, really up and away from me. It really was like as if years of tensions were unraveling with each strike. Every time he left, I felt he was taking years of anger away from me. He really was my own Mr. Gray version, I guess you could call it. And I really called him that, Mr. Gray. I think he was in my phone for that for a number of years. But it's too bad because I'm almost embarrassed to say this. But yeah, all I remember him as is actually Mr. Gray. But seriously, every time he left, I was able to sleep like a baby. For a number of years, I found it super, super difficult to sleep. But I always slept like a baby after we were done. Now, for this next part, I do want to give a bit of a trigger warning. Because a few weeks later into this arrangement, I was sexually assaulted and raped sleeping at a friend's house. And because of this, I obviously stopped. For the first month after my assault, I really did try to act like everything was okay. But then my hair started to fall out in considerably big chunks, and that's when I went into therapy. So I did my own research, and I looked specifically for a sex therapist that could help me and help my experience with my rape and the trial that followed. But really, my rape and the trial wasn't nearly as painful as how my family made me feel during this whole process, specifically my mother and my brother, really on my mom's side. So I really think my mom thought that it was a joke. She and I never had a good relationship, and at the time weren't really talking. But sometime during my trial, my grandmother got sick, and my mom and I had to reconcile while she was in the hospital. While my grandmother was in the hospital. And while we were catching up, I told her that I couldn't go to one of my favorite restaurants anymore because my rapist worked there. Then the very next time she was in town, she actually took her and my brother and her husband there for dinner. And how I found out is my brother told me, and so at this point I was absolutely destroyed. Like, I knew my mom and I were never good, but this was just way too much for me to handle. And because, and that eventually became the final straw that broke my relationship with my family. But really, my assault was a wake-up call to how little my family actually cared about me. So after finding out the news, I told my mom and confronted her, and my brother ended up apologizing to my mom for telling. So at the same time as my trial and I was still going through therapy, I realized that in order to heal from all of it, I needed to walk away from the whole situation. And by walking away from that, I realized that I was born and raised in a very narcissistic family dynamic. But that pain hurt a lot more than my assault. And I had to grieve people that were still alive. And the feeling of having no family going through this was absolutely tearing me apart. And I really couldn't take it anymore. So ultimately, I quickly clung onto someone who made me feel incredibly safe and secure, which coincidentally was my best friend at the time. And we ended up getting together and actually started dating, and we seemed like a perfect couple. We never fought, and we were always traveling. But what people didn't know is we just didn't match sexually. We just weren't into the same things. And instead of us ending it, we agreed to be in an open relationship, and the doors to BDSM were open again. It was through this relationship that I was properly introduced to kink. Kink is where I truly learned the magic that sex can create. Kink really changed my life. I was taught how to structure scenes or scenarios or sex encounters that weren't just about anger. I started creating scenes that made me feel safe and loved, encouraged, motivated, you name it, any positive attribute. I was building something like that so I could feel that. And I was able to ask and receive the exact attention I wanted. Kink actually was more overwhelming than getting my anger out through BDSM. I actually used kink to build my confidence back. I faced fears. I ended nightmares that were taking up too much space in my head. And during this time and going through this transformation and learning more about myself and my sexual self, my bestie and I learned that having an open relationship wasn't something we wanted. And we ended that relationship, but still remain great friends, and I absolutely love him dearly. But then in 2020, I went back to school for business and entrepreneurship because I wanted to own my own retreat. I had done travel and tourism and worked in a number of hotels. And closer to the end of the school year, I had established this dom-sub partnership with someone who was helping me with my business plan. And funny enough, one day while we were working on it, he jokingly said that I should open up a sex retreat. At first I thought it was a joke, but then the more I thought about it, the more crazier it seemed that I could actually pull this off. I had worked with a sex therapist for a number of years. I saw the improvements that BDSM and kink had made for myself, but I also knew that there was a number of rookie mistakes that I could have avoided had I just spoken with someone. If BDSM and kink was a little bit more open to talk about, there would have been so many just basic things that I could have avoided for myself and saved myself a headache quite a few times. And the final straw was really looking back at myself and seeing how I had redefined sexual wellness and how sexual healing through BDSM and kink really did help me. It was one thing to talk about my feelings, but it was another when I was feeling those energies through my skin out that absolutely just changed everything for me. So in 2021, I took that idea and entered my college business summit competition. And it was a competition for the best business idea and pitch. So out of all the business proposals that got entered, only a handful were chosen. So I applied for the competition under a regular wellness retreat. And it was only after I got accepted and introduced myself to the panel that I even outlined that my pitch was actually for a sexual wellness retreat. I do think that it helped me, and I know it definitely caught everyone by surprise because by the end of the day, on the first day, I had to explain why I didn't say it was a sexual wellness retreat in the first place. And I said, to be honest, I thought my business plan wouldn't be accepted or even looked at, quite frankly. But after everything was said and done, my sexual wellness retreat won first place. And that's when I knew that the world was ready for some kinky wellness. But that same Dom also taught me the importance of ethics. And that's why I created the BDSM Basics, because the most basic rule for BDSM and kink is partaking ethically. Now, there's a lot of unethical people out there that claim that they're in the BDSM and kink community. But unless you're partaking ethically, then you're not partaking in BDSM and kink. Now, I want to stress that getting into BDSM and kink takes a lot of self-awareness. It takes honesty, responsibility, ethics, accountability. I really believe that not everyone can do it. It's not, BDSM isn't a place to run. It's not to hide. It's not something for self-harm. It's not an escape. It really is a form of self-expression. And I also want to stress that BDSM and kink activities, they're not all 100% safe. Many activities come with their own inherent risks. And just like in sports, it only takes one wrong point of contact for damage to happen or even death. No one can make a guarantee that an accident won't happen. But through the partnership basics, impact basics, and plan and prep basics of BDSM and kink, you do have a greater potential to make the activity safer. But it really isn't as intimidating as people think it is. Because once you know your basics, then you can do BDSM at whatever level that you feel comfortable with. But can I tell you why I really, really love BDSM and kink so much? Really? I can say it's because it gave me a dedicated space to transcend my pain and anger, or that it helps me communicate on how I want to be treated, Or how it let me wrestle my demons down so at the end of the story, I was the victor and not the victim. But really, I love BDSM and kink because it brought back one of my favorite things to do, which is playing rough. And playing rough is something I will always be doing. I think it's just in me to be. It's just part of who I am. And that's kind of a quick snapshot of how I got here. And I know it wasn't as simple or straightforward. There's a lot of elements here. But why we want to enter BDSM and kink is a complicated question that has a complicated answer. And humans are deep, complicated creatures. And if I've learned anything from Shrek, it's that humans are like ogres. And if you know anything about ogres, you know that they are like onions. And if you know anything about onions, you know that they have layers. So don't rush into BDSM and kink. Give yourself time to peel back those layers one at a time and meet your sexual self with love and open arms. Well, that's a little bit about how I got here. Thank you for listening. If you're new here or to the BDSM scene, check out my e-learning video, BDSM Basics, at thepartition.life, where I make it easy to learn the basics of BDSM. Again, that's www.thepartition.life. Thank you for listening. Tune in next time, and as always, stay kinky.